Hi there, froggies! Ranafroggie here. We're coming at you today with a tutorial video on how to make corsets. I use the word corset very loosely because while this is not something you would traditionally see in a corset video and how to construct it in actual corsetry, it's going to be somewhat of an unconventional method. I don't know if this is something that I just kind of came up with, that it works, or maybe it really doesn't and I'm just losing my mind, but it does still do the lace-up bit in the back or in the front, depending on what you like, and it will still provide a little bit of body shaping and sculpting. So if you want to cinch in the waist more, you can, and you can totally do that. We will be going over a patterning process, which is also unconventional. You will hear that word a lot from me, unconventional. We're going to go over the patterning process, and we are going to go over the sewing process, and we are going to go over a hardware installation as well, which is going to be something that's very brief, but we're going to try to go over it anyway, and I will be talking to you guys along the way of why I do this and what this means and how this functions, and we'll go over all of it. I'm so sorry for the length of this video, so if you would like to skip any part, any of the subsections here, it's going to be where you're going to start the sewing process and the hardware and all the patterning and sewing there. So if you want to skip to anything there, you know exactly where to go there. So alrighty, let's jump right on in. Alrighty, from here we are going to be setting up the template and everything. I'm using butcher paper here. You can definitely use something like a trash bag or like grocery bags if you've got them, or newspapers, whatever you've got on hand really. This is just to keep the tape from sticking to your model. You could also do this on a real person. You do not have to do this on like a plaster shell form like I have of my body here. I like to try to cinch down the waist as a start just to make sure that it doesn't like slide up or down too terribly much. It will inevitably, but it'll be a lot better to just start with the waist. You don't want to do this too terribly tight on your model, or if you're doing it on your actual body. If you do it too tight, this is really going to be uncomfortable for you later. So you just want something that's just form-fitting. This is really just to nail down the shape of the body at first, so this is really nothing terribly critical at this point. It is also a really good idea to start kind of getting in crosshatches there in the taping so that you don't get anything coming up. If you try to go in just one direction the whole time, it'll have a tendency to kind of peel up on you. You could also use duct tape for this. I prefer this type of tape just because it's easier to draw on with like a pencil or something in case I really need to. Duct tape is pretty much marker and Sharpie only, so I really prefer to use this, but you could really use just about whatever you want and whatever you've got on hand. At some point I do like to kind of seal the deal with a front tape going completely vertical both on the back and on the front. I try to tend to mark this by marking it with the spine, kind of feeling where the spine should be and placing the tape there. And then I also do this by marking where the belly button is and the collarbone and trying to make a straight line from there as well. This is just so that it's a lot easier to try to mark the front and the back center, which is going to be the pinnacle and the major point for our corset here today. However, even if you don't get anything exact as far as like your tape goes, that is what we're going to be drawing on our form later. So at this point I like to try to start by marking the front center and the back center, touching up any pieces that you see you'll need to go all along. It is always better to try to tape beyond where you think your template is going to go, so that gives you a lot of control when you go to cut it out later. Now from here, I like to divide this up, and you could really do just about any configuration of panels that you want. I chose to have 4 in total, one front, one side or two side really, and then one back. You could really do these, and you do not have to be in any configuration. You could really get very creative with this and do as many panels as you want. I do like to mark these, however, as right front, so RF, and then right front 1, RF1, and then RB1 and RB for right back and right back 1. I also like to point out which point is up. This really helps much later on when you're patterning and when you're cutting it all out, just to make sure that you don't put a panel in upside down. Once you have your pattern all drawn out onto your form, you can utilize this time to kind of measure it out and see if that's going to be long enough or too short, and adjust it from there. This really is just a get the form down, and then you can really adjust and kind of draw it out from there. From here, we are going to be doing a series of 3 patterns. So there's this first pattern we've just completed. We're going to be transferring this to butcher paper, and then we're going to be transferring that to cardstock. There's a few different reasons for this. Honestly, you could really take any template that we could create from here and just copy it to your fabric and cut it out and sew it together. I'm choosing this for various different reasons, and we'll go into those as we go along. But first we have to cut out our paper template. We have to cut it off of our model or our form and cut it out from there. So, and once this is all cut out like this and not separated from each other, you can use this opportunity to kind of measure it against your body and to see if it's actually going to fit you or if it's going to be too small. From here, this is really very wobbly, and it has a lot of curves and stuff to it, which is great. We need those curves to determine our size and everything. But right now we just need to cut it out. As you can see, they do tend to be a little wobbly at this point because they do still have a lot of dimension to them. This is why we're going to do at least the first pass of the butcher paper to solidify the template and make sure that it doesn't get all wibble wobbly. So taking your butcher paper, but again you can use just about anything, I like to start with the back panel and the front panels. I like to do this because I can utilize the edge of the paper and make sure that the back edge of the right back panel is going to be perfectly straight. So just lining up the edges and where the lines should be perfectly straight, I just trace out the template as it is. Also remarking the orientation and the panel name just so that we don't get confused later. So as you'll see from my right front panel here, you can see that because I have a little bit of a pooch, there's a little bit of a curve there. That is totally fine, but we do want that edge to be straight. So what we're going to do is just line up our top and our bottom points of the panel and just trace out the rest of the pattern as it is. And we're not even going to worry about that curved edge. So we've already done a little bit of fixing and body shaping here. So now from here, we want to try to make sure that the curves of the panels are as smooth as possible, because sometimes when you do this, they tend to be a little bit rough. So right here with the red Sharpie, I'm just going in and fixing, making sure that that curve is just a little bit more curvy and a little bit nicer and smoother. And we're doing the same thing to the right back panel here. You do want to be careful when doing this, because as you see, I did come in about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch here on the edge. This really can help with the body shaping, but you want to make sure that you don't bring it in so far and try to make your waist so much smaller than it is, because that really can be painful and uncomfortable and can be really dangerous. So just keep in mind how much you are taking off of your patterns, because it does fit you more or less at the beginning, and the more you take off, the smaller it's going to be for you. So keep this in mind as you're going. If you need to adjust it quite a lot on the curve, go ahead and give yourself a little bit extra for that template. So here's the comparison between the two panels here. And now we have half of our templates done up. So now we have to take our right front one panel, and I started with this one simply because one of the curves I already very much agreed with, so I didn't really need to do any additional work on that piece. However, on the other side of this panel, it needs to match up the same curve that we did up on our RF panel. So for now, just go ahead and trace it out as it is there. Now, because it has an edge with the RF panel, we need to make sure that these two curves line up. They're pretty close here, but not quite close enough for my taste. So all you do is you put them right sides together and then trace that curve that you cut out from the RF panel. And this is where a secondary marker would really help you out here. So then these concave curves that we're putting together is what's really going to help give the garment dimension and make it so that it can really conform to the general shape of a waist. So then here's the comparison of the two panels. So now we have to argue with our RB1 panel. As you can see, this edge here does not match up or line up at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to fix that. It more or less lines up with the back panel there, which is fine. But essentially all we're going to be doing is taking that top line and the bottom line and then adjusting our side curves there. So just trace it out as it is and as you see it. And then mark it accordingly. So now right sides facing together, we are going to readjust the curve, lining them up at the top and bottom. So here are all of our patterns that we have so far. This is a good opportunity to double check and make sure that they line up and they are the same length on the points where they connect together. Sometimes they get a little off, and the way to fix this is to just kind of snip it and then blend it in with the rest of the template there. So now we're going to be transferring this to cardstock, and you really could at this point just transfer the butcher paper over to your fabric and then just cut it out from there, eyeballing the seam allowance. I would prefer not to do that just because that's not what I like to do. So we're going to kind of go over a little bit of seam allowance ideas here too. So for starters, we're just going to trace it out as it is, label it appropriately. So I'm going to give this about a 1/2 inch seam allowance on just the top and bottom. And I do this by lining up an inch marker somewhere and then just kind of doing small ticks along the 1/2 inch line from there. So this is really just to create some sort of dotted line so that we can draw it in later. Now I only add seam allowance to the top and bottom of my corsets because this will keep it from being shorter than I want, but this will also, not having it on the sides also lets me kind of get a little bit more body and waist cinching. This is also something you really want to be careful of. Do not make this too small for you. I don't want to hear about anybody passing out because their corset was too small. So then from here you just finish drawing out your line. But I also specifically don't put in the seam allowance on the sides because I only use 1/4 inch. But when you think about that, when you take off 1/4 inch on both sides, that is a whole inch you're taking off one single panel. And we have a total of 8 panels. So you're taking off 1/2 inch times 8, which is going to be a total of about 4 inches. So you want to make sure that you can withstand something like that. If you can withstand more, that's great. Body shaping and corset training can really help you do that. Do not do it too small for you and think that this should cinch closed. Did everything else is the same there. We just extended it out a little bit there. If you end up finding that you could just barely not fit one of your pattern pieces onto some paper, I like to use this tape method. I just put tape on both sides of the pattern and then trace out where the corner should be, cut that out, and just leave that. It's not the strongest corner in the world, but it's one of those, if your pattern just barely doesn't fit, this is a good way to kind of keep that from happening. So for the back piece, I also decided to extend this out about a 1/2 inch. I wish I had done this a little bit more with some of the other decisions I had made in sewing later, but this was something that usually you want to do because you want to make sure that when you turn everything inside out, you have that extra seam allowance that you can stitch it down and you have that extra inch. Because it's really difficult to try to fold over a 1/4 of an inch as opposed to a 1/2 inch. Although, of course, if you want to try to add more seam allowance, by all means go for that as well. So moving on to the sewing piece here, this strip here is going to be used for our boning channel. I point this out because the dimensions that I use for this are about 1.25 inches. Now this isn't something super tricky there, but I'd like to point out something interesting for this. I did use 100% cotton. I used a couple fabric quarters to get the lining out, and the boning channels are made of the same material. Something interesting about these is with 100% cottons, what you can do is you can make a small snip into the fabric, about 1 inch big, and you can tear the fabric. And this is the straightest cut you'll ever see because it follows the grain of the fabric, so you can do this both directions there. So now you want to cut out 2 of each of your panels there. And something additional and something optional that you can do here is you can go ahead and do a small top stitch on your boning channels just to kind of prep them and make it a little bit easier, but this is really not necessary. I ended up not doing this, I just ironed them flat. So I started with the front fabric that I'm using. I separated them into the right and left sides of our corset, and I usually just try to focus on one side at a time. So I then try to sew the right front so the RF and the RF1 panels together, and then I also try to do the RB and the RB1 panels together. So, and then when you finish with those, you can combine them together and everything works out. An additional trick you can try here is instead of cutting your fabric away when you finish sewing it, just go ahead and pull it off to the side and leave your thread attached, and then just keep sewing there. This will kind of attach to pieces and will make it so that you do have to turn this thread later, but I find it's a little bit of a time saver and a little bit of a thread saver as well. I also prefer to mark my fabric so that I can also keep the orientation of the panels correct. This is also a good reason why I don't like to kind of guess on my seam allowance, is usually I can put these things together without having to use pins or anything, and if everything is already cut out perfectly as it should be, then I know that they're just going to line up on the edges and there's no real guesswork there for me. But if you are more comfortable using pins, by all means go ahead and use pins there. So now that our front and left panels are all put together, we're going to go ahead and attach the 2. I only used about a 1/4 inch seam allowance on all the panels, and we want to make sure that we iron those flat. This is really going to help the thread kind of sink into your fabric a little bit better and help everything lay flatter. And having the seam open like that is really also going to help things lay a little bit flatter for you. A little bit less bulk in there. So we have our front part together. Now we're going to try to move on to our lining. This is going to be a little bit tricky. So from here, we're going to be inserting our boning channel in between two of our pieces. So if we have our right front and our RF1, we're going to be essentially folding this piece of fabric in half and then lining up all the edges there and stitching them all together with the same 1/4 inch seam allowance. I am using Wonder Clips here, but you're more than welcome to use pins or just kind of go for it. Also, please note, if you are using pins, make sure you're not stitching over them. I do this frequently. It's a very bad idea. You can risk the pins kind of hitting your needle, and something could really explode or shoot back out at your face. So I guess if at the very least you do just want to do that anyway, wear like safety goggles or something. So with this 1/4 inch seam allowance here, we have our boning channel inserted. So this leaves a nice little loop that we can insert our bones in. And this is just what the size that I had used based on what I'm using for bones, which we will get into here in a bit. There is a hole in there, and you want to make sure that your bone can fit into this hole. If it's too snug, we're going to have a little bit of a problem, so you might want to extend your boning channel. It is important to check this every time you do a new boning channel. So testing our bone here. So it should slide in pretty okay, and it might be a little loose for now, but that's okay. We are going to top stitch this down, and the reason we're going to do this is so that it doesn't end up flopping around, and especially when you combine your facing and your lining, this is really going to keep it from like moving around too much. You really want it to remain stationary. And I'm doing this as close as I can to the edge. I am actually using my presser foot to really try to line it up. The name of the game here is just to try to go as slow as you can and try not to rush it, because that's where bad things will happen if you rush this part. So at this point you should also be able to comfortably insert your bone. If it ends up being a little snug, that's okay. You just want to make sure that it's tight enough that your boning is not going to twist in the channel. When it starts to twist, that is where things become uncomfortable and can really start to poke you. So from here, we're just going to do this same process for all in between our panels. So we're going to combine all our panels, insert this boning channel. For our back side, we are just going to attach it right up against the edge. And we want to make sure that we test this each time and make sure that our boning fits in before we do the top stitch and after we do the top stitch. So as you can see, there are some points where I did miss the channel just a little bit. This is okay enough. This is going to be the facing, so it's not the end of the world. You do want to make sure when you insert your boning though, that you insert it into the tube and not the space underneath the tube. So from here, we can take a moment to kind of measure how big our seams are and how long they are. Because I have that 1/2 inch seam allowance on the top and the bottom, I am measuring 1 inch from the end, in the top and the bottom of these panels, and this should be the length that you need for each bone. And this is to make sure that I have enough room for the seam allowance of the 1/2 inch, but it also gives me a chance to make sure that I have room for that 1/4 inch top stitch that we're going to do later. While we're on the subject of bones, what I used for this was a filing organizer system there, and I used the metal aluminum rods from there. I would not recommend these all the time. If you can find ones that are much sturdier, by all means go for those. But I would really honestly just try to go for actual bones here and just try to accommodate for what you're planning on doing with them. Now, a big reason you want to try to make sure that you are not missing your channel and that you're inserting your bone beneath it is because if you miss your channel while you're top stitching it down, it has a very high chance to just kind of pop out and not sit in there. So that closed channel really is going to keep your bone in place without it getting all wonky on you. So from here, we have to combine our lining and our facing. This is really just a simple process of just making sure all the edges line up. It is a good idea to kind of note where your seams are and lining them up from there, as well as the edges of the fabric. This will help it all lay just as nice as possible and just be a lot easier for you. I am using Wonder Clips here, but you can use pins or whatever else you want, or you can just not use it at all, whichever you like. I am going to be stitching up one flat side of the corset and leaving the other side open so that it can be turned right side out after everything is said and done. You could really do this just about anywhere. I chose to do the backs specifically for turning right side out, and then when you go and top stitch it down and try to fold it in, it's going to be a lot easier to do a flat side rather than any of the curves that are happening on the top or bottom of the corset. It is better in this situation to utilize a slightly smaller stitch length, because when you go and turn it right side out, everything is going to sit a little bit nicer and you're not going to notice your stitches as much as you would to a longer stitch length. And then also be careful with this particular portion, because your bones have been inserted at this point. Just be careful of your bones. Please do not break your needle on them. That really can be very dangerous. Try to wear some eye protection if you've got it. If you have the option to kind of shimmy the bones away from where you're stitching, go ahead and do that, and then try to shimmy them back as close as you can. It's always a little bit better to have your bones just a little bit shorter in this instance than a little bit longer and risk breaking a needle or just totally demolishing your bone or something. from here, we're going to try to make this sit as flat as we can on the inside. This will probably be best done with small triangles cut out all along the curved edges. I just did really small snips. Make sure that you don't cut into your seams, but get as close as you can without cutting into them. I chose to do just the small snips because I felt that it would be fine, and in all reality, it really turned out okay for me. Clip any corners if you've got them. I did blunt off the tip of the front panels, and that's really the most important part because that's really going to have a lot of bulk later and is really going to be very noticeable when you turn it right side out. So pretty much just snip the tip there. So then from here, we're going to try to carefully turn this right side out. Because of the bones that I'm using, they have a very big tendency to kind of bend. I believe there's some form of aluminum. Just go for the steel boning. They're not that much more expensive. I would just go for those. So I did end up bending these a few times, but just kind of work with it and go real slow to try to get one piece out at a time. The biggest struggle that I ran into was those middle panels. They really wanted to kind of kink and bend the most. So now we want to move on to ironing. Kind of rub these two layers back and forth to try to get them as even as they can. So before we get to the ironing, we want to try to kind of poke out our corners as best we can. This can be a little bit tricky. Don't use anything that's super sharp, otherwise you're just going to poke right through your seam and ruin everything you've just done. The boning channels being stitched down properly and inserted into the right section is where this came into play. I had to fiddle with this corner a little bit more because that center one is not in the boning channel, it is underneath. And because I missed the boning channel on the top stitch on the bottom side, it ended up poking out from the bottom. So I actually had to go in and kind of hand stitch that back down. For the ironing here, we only really want to make sure that the lining is not poking out from underneath. We just want to try to make sure that we can only see our top facing fabric. And the ironing will help us kind of keep it down that way. Onto the top stitching, I only used wonder clips here on this end because this was the open end on the back. I went ahead and just used a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the end to do this top stitch. I ended up also switching the thread to like a gold thread just to match. You also want to really be careful of your bones here because they don't really have too many other places to go. You just want to make sure that you're not hitting them. I did run into a little bit of a problem here. This edge didn't really allow me to have a whole lot of extra seam allowance, so I had to kind of pull it back out and give myself a little bit more fabric to hold on to. So it's not quite a 1/4 of an inch on this end. It's just enough to try to keep it from sliding around. I did run into a little bit of a problem with this tip here because the boning ended up being just a little bit longer than I wanted. So I actually had to have a little bit of a lapse in top stitching here, but it ended up not being a super huge deal. So we are just about done here. All we have left now is to insert our eyelets. And we can use our pattern here to kind of mark where that's supposed to be. What I did is I marked about 1/2 inch away from where the seam stops, and that would be my first and last point of where the eyelet should be inserted. I then folded those in half to find the center point, marked that as another hole there, and then I folded it in half again to the middle to have a total of 5 holes. So then from here, I went ahead and used a punch to pull out the holes that I needed there. This ended up being just a little bit too small for the eyelets that I was using, but it ended up being okay because I like to have them be just a little bit more snug here. Having stabilizer and interfacing inside of where you're going to insert the bones is a better idea. I really wished I had done that here, but I didn't, so forethought for you. Insert a little bit of stabilizer because I did have a little bit of tearing in my lining here when I had worn it for the first time. So I had marked these with a water-soluble marker and double checked to make sure that these were more or less in line with the boning and they wouldn't interfere there. They ended up being off in a few spots, so I just went and fixed those. So I used the same punch again to mark the holes in all the fabric there. You can always do this one hole at a time and insert the eyelets as you go. I chose to do all the holes up front. I do love these eyelets a great deal. These work pretty simply. You can use a male and a female end. So the male end will go into the front side of your fabric. I ended up having to make my hole just a smidgen bigger. So you insert your male side there, put the setting tool on the bottom, the back part, and then you put your female end on top, hammer it down, and that male end will curl backward around the female end and will keep everything down in place. The thicker your material is here, the less likely you're going to have any problems of your fabric tearing. You really want to make sure you give yourself as much bulk here so that it doesn't like tear or come across it. You want to make sure that those eyelets have something really nice to just kind of grab onto. So then from here, I like to kind of BS this a little bit, and I just line up the sides of my corset, mark where the holes are on the one side, and then just cut them out, making sure that they're not interfering with the boning or anything. And then again, punching up the holes and then inserting the eyelets as before. Alrighty guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Hopefully you enjoyed the tutorial. There might be some other stuff coming from the showcase video there at the end. Might be elf ears. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. If you guys want to see anything else, please be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And thanks so much for watching again, you guys.